Welcome by the Theosophical Society Point Loma. Today is the last lecture in the series Theosophia, the mother of all religions. And in this lecture, the inner path, we will explore how we can achieve the goal of religion, unification with the inner God. The metaphor of the path is found in many religions. Buddhism speaks of an eightfold path. The Sufis speak of the path of knowledge, and many other religious traditions speak of a path. And it's, of course, an inner path. H.P. Blavatsky says in The Voice of the Silence, "Thou canst not travel on the path before thou hast become the path itself." So the path is not somewhere outside of you. You don't have to go to India or to Tibet or any other place to expand your consciousness. The path is within you, but this is also evident from the saying, you have to become it. We are it, but we must become it. That is a paradox which can only be explained by the idea that within us, within our consciousness, there are a number of characteristics, a number of aspects of consciousness that are apparently still dormant, and they are still asleep, and we must awaken those aspects. We must become those aspects, because otherwise we cannot walk the inner path. Almost all mystical writings speak of the path, and always they mean the inner path. In one of the sacred books of Hinduism, Dhyanasavari, Krishna says, "To whatever place thou wilt go on this path, that place becomes thyself." And this statement also clearly shows that we are not dealing with a path that lies outside ourselves, but it is about bringing about something within ourselves. And this also means that it is not about serving something or somebody outside yourself. It's not about begging a god or gods for something. In the West, we are usually raised with the Christian faith, and even if we no longer profess it, the idea prevails that for spiritual growth, we need someone else, a god or gods or angels, maybe a Buddha or master. Now, we certainly need teachers, but we have to do it ourselves. The teachers show us the way, but we have to walk it. So the inner path is not about prayers and rituals either. Rituals can help some focus on spiritual matters, but it is not because of the prayers of the rituals that you progress on the inner path. No, you have to do it yourself. It's a matter of self-activity. Christians also point us to the path. According to the Gospel, Jesus is said to have said, "I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." That is a very mystical statement and completely true, at least if you interpret it in the esoteric way. We come back to that in a moment. The path is therefore not a physical road, but an inner process of development which leads to access to other worlds. Now, this entire series is devoted to religion, not a religion or faith or worship, but religion per se. And we have defined religion as striving for unification with the source from which everything originates by choosing an attitude to life that we implement with our noblest aspects of consciousness and considering all this as the highest law or duty. It is that union with the source, the path to the source, that is religion. That is the inner path. But you must immediately make a note. that source is not located somewhere in the cosmos, like the source of a river is located somewhere on a mountain or something. No, the source is a metaphor representing the one life, the unity of existence, the one life principle that flows through everything and everyone. Union with that source, walking the inner path, is therefore a process of awareness in which you become increasingly aware of the fact that there is unity. There is diversity in the outer world. Beings differ in their manifestation. In their outer form, they differ from each other. But that is actually an illusion. Because in the heart of the heart, in the core of their core, they are one. They are the one life. And within us, the innermost part of our innermost being, there is an element, a self, a higher self, our inner God. Within us is that self that knows that unity, that knows that we are all rays from the same sun, drawn from the same life. And that self is called Ātman in Sanskrit, a word that cannot be translated or hardly be translated, and whose Sanskrit root, that is from which it is derived, is also unknown. Well, it is that self, Ātman, that we must know in accordance with the commandment above the temple of Apollo in Delphi, know thyself. And it is that self to which the inner path leads. And as Krishna said, to whatever place you will go on the path, that place becomes yourself. So we will become the self. We will become the inner God if we successfully walk the inner path. But there are stages on that path. In other words, there are different stages on the path to expanding consciousness. We are not only Ātman, we are composite beings. We possess different principles of consciousness. Now, Ātman is pure consciousness. It's the I am consciousness. It's not the consciousness of the ego, of the personality. That is the consciousness of I am I. Nevertheless, the lower aspects of Ātman take on certain forms. In other words, a principle of consciousness flow from Ātman, which we can call Buddhi. Buddhi is a word derived from the Sanskrit root Bud, meaning awakening. It's the consciousness that enables us to see the inseparable connections between everything, between beings, whether highly developed or not, close to us or far away. There are connections, there are bonds between all those beings. The Buddhi within us is insight in those connections, awakens understanding in us. We see through the outer world in which being seems to be separate from each other. And when we develop Buddhi within us, we know that it's not so. We know that it's an illusion. And then if we evolve Buddhi, we can see through the illusion. And we can see through the fact that we are not separated. And that awareness of connectedness that Buddhi brings about in us awakens an impersonal love, compassion. For most of us, Buddhi is still barely developed. We live much more in manas, in the intellectual part of our consciousness. And sometimes we just be active as cool, reasoning beings, analyzing and sorting out facts. Well, that's not a bad quality, but it's not the same quality as the warmth of the Buddhic heart. And to complete the picture, there are 4 other principles also arising from Ātman, which we can call the lower or personal human being. Our thinking, and manas, our mind, can focus on and identify with those lower aspects. And then we have no urge, then we have no will to walk the inner path. Then we are satisfied with this outer world, or often we are not satisfied, but we still don't want to give up this world. But when the mind focuses on buddhi, when there is a will to develop buddhi, then the aspiration to walk the inner path arises. Then we seek unity, the unity of Ātman. With this knowledge, let us look again at the words attributed to Jesus. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Well, it's clear that the Father refers to Ātman. After all, the entire manifestation, the whole human being, arises from and emanates from Ātman. And me, the Christ, is nothing other than the buddhi. No one can unite, become aware of the unity of life, if it's not through the path of buddhi, through the Christ principle. That's to say, the spiritual element within us, which makes us see the inseparable interconnectedness of all living beings. And that is accompanied by impersonal love and compassion. No one comes to Ātman unless he first develops buddhi, awakens the impersonal idea in himself and lives in it. That is the inner path we must walk. How do we walk that path? Well, let's first say something about the pace. I mean, you can walk the inner path very quickly, or you can take your time. You can say, well, tomorrow is another day. Not everything has to happen in this life. There will be more lives. In other words, you do certain things, but it is not the highest priority. You can also say, I won't let a single hour pass by. I will use my entire life to develop the spiritual aspects in my consciousness. I consider wisdom, insight, and spiritual growth more important than a career or perhaps even a family. Now let me remind you once again of what we said 2 weeks ago. There is an esoteric side of religion and there is an exoteric side. And the esoteric side is for the few. For those who, to quote the Bible, want to take the kingdom of heaven by force. Those who do so have one purpose in reaching the kingdom of heaven as quickly as possible. The kingdom of heaven in which, according to the scripture, is within us. It symbolizes an Ātmic state of consciousness in which you are aware of the unity of life. But there are also those who are neither too good nor too bad, who occasionally show some understanding and love, who care about their fellow human beings, but who also want to live in this material world. And for them, there is the exoteric side of religion. And this exoteric side makes use of imagery, of myths, parables. It's not the direct teaching of the esoteric side of religion. Yet, it's not untrue, nor is the ethics that are thought necessarily bad, certainly not. But those ethics often do not arise from an understanding of the inner side of life, of the laws of life that exist. Those ethics are often reduced to a few rules that must be followed. But since the background to those rules is often missing, or at least not taken too seriously, those rules, those prohibitions and commandments often do not have the power they should have. Take, for example, the well-known 10 Commandments from the Bible. We will not go through all the 10 rules now, We don't have time for that, and it would not provide much insight. It only shows that the ethics of exoteric religions, or rather beliefs, may consist of rules which, in this case, according to the Bible, were given by God himself to Moses on Mount Sinai. And since these rules are said to originate from God himself, you would expect them to have had at least some influence on people and society, at least on Jewish and Christian society. Unfortunately, you can hardly detect any influence. Let's take the first one. Do not worship any god. If you take this literally, we are dealing with a jealous God who wants all the attention for himself. The esoteric background, however, is that the divine and the unity of life should receive all the attention. An exoteric interpretation of the Ten Commandments can lead to a lot of misery, because if you don't put the one God, the tribal God of the Jews adopted by the Christians first, then you are a heretic and a second-class citizen. And we know that this has happened all too often, and it still happens. There were times that the punishment for idolatry, making images of the divine, was death. How does that fit in with the sixth commandment, you may ask? You should not kill. Well, let's take a closer look at that sixth commandment. Who adheres to it? Isn't the development of weapons, bombs, missiles that serve only to kill others, the almost absurd armament of virtually every country, contrary to this commandment? And waging war, can that happen without killing anyone? Some Christians interpret the sixth commandment as a strong argument against abortion, but strangely enough, many of them are in favor of the death penalty. Moreover, if you really want to follow this commandment, you should never eat meat, for you can only do so because animals have been killed. And this commandment contains no restrictions, no exceptions. It does not say that you are allowed to kill animals. In short, the commandment is excellent in itself, and the world would be a much better place if we applied it. But that doesn't happen, and it has never happened in the Jewish and Christian world. Does such a commandment make sense if you don't provide the arguments, if you don't provide the background, the philosophical background that allow people to draw their own conclusion that you should never kill anyone? If not, then it remains a paper tiger, nicely said, but of little use. And this applies not just to Christianity, this applies to so many other commandments in other religions. Even if we do more or less follow the rules, they don't really encourage us to follow the inner path. It's more that we use them to keep society orderly. And there's nothing wrong with that in itself, of course not. But as long as you don't explain the background, there's a good chance that no one will follow them. Imagine that you are unfamiliar with the traffic rules here in our world, and someone tells you that red means stop. But they don't mention that the other road at the intersection is allowed to drive on. Then such rules make little sense to you. In ancient China, Confucius was the philosopher with many such external rules, and people generally obeyed them, but that was because there was a heavy penalty for breaking them. Lao Tse, contemporary of Confucius, had no external rules, but his religious, philosophical paradoxes make you think, so that you yourself draw practical, ethical conclusion, and that's a greater incentive to enter the inner path. So rules, let's call them reminders, can be useful, especially for beginners, but you need to understand them. You need to see their usefulness. So there needs to be some kind of religious philosophical background. Then they can serve as a guide. Compare it to a child learning to ride a bike. There are bikes with training wheels, which are 2 extra wheels that prevent you from falling. If the child can ride properly, you can safely remove the training wheels. Well, we spoke about the exoteric and esoteric side of religion. Well, even people who do not want to take the conscious step of taking the kingdom of heaven by force, and that is those who don't choose the esoteric path, which is the accelerated path, they can still follow the inner path, albeit perhaps more slowly. Nevertheless, by following the path, they will avoid certain forms of suffering and contribute to a more just state of affairs in the world. You know, from the universal Theosophical movement, people are always advised and inspired to walk the inner path. But no one will ever tell you what to do in a specific situation. First of all, the duty of others, as the Bhagavad Gita states, is fraught with danger. But moreover, we always respect the free will of everybody. And you see, if you decide to walk the inner path, a lot can happen in your life. Certain karmic causes come to the surface more quickly. If you had not decided to change your life, certain causes might only have manifested themselves in different lives. But because of your decision, they may now have consequences in this life. Some problems and challenges could be solved with a little effort, but if 10 of 12 such problems and challenges suddenly arise, we will still be able to remain calm and bring everything to a successful solution. The esoteric path is like a pressure cooker. Everything goes faster. Everything is more intense. And that's why you must always think carefully and consider everything when making a decision regarding spiritual growth. It's good to be courageous, but it's not good to be reckless. By choosing a slightly slower path may be a good choice. Better than suddenly changing course radically and finding out after a few years, or perhaps even a few months, that you completely lack the discipline to follow the esoteric path and have turned your life into chaos and misery. Then it is wiser to follow the somewhat slower, but nevertheless also on target exoteric path. The exoteric side of religion also ultimately brings you to the goal, to the awareness of the unity of life. And the rules imposed by the outer beliefs, however, you must ponder and not blindly accept as true. Don't forget that the meaning of the commandments and rules are reminders. And in that respect, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path of Buddhism are a much better guarantee of walking the inner path than rules whose usefulness you don't understand. Not because they are fundamentally different, but because in the Fourth Noble Truths you find the arguments for why you should follow the Eightfold Path. Here are the Four Noble Truths. The Noble Truth about sorrow and pain. The Noble Truth about the cause of sorrow and pain. The Noble Truth about the cessation of sorrow and pain. And the Noble Truth about the path that leads to the cessation. These Four Noble Truths encourage us to reflect. They confront us with facts. They make us think. They pose questions to us, as it were. Why is the manifested world accompanied by suffering? Have you thought about that? Of course, there are moments in life when we don't suffer, but those moments come to an end. There is no permanency. Healthy people may become ill, young people grow old and may become dependent on others. Loved ones leave or pass away. We ourselves also pass away. It is this state that is called samsara, the state of attachment to external life. Some accuse Buddhism of pessimism because it claims that external life is accompanied by suffering. That's not the case. It is realistic. The second truth indicates why suffering exists. It's the transience of existence and our attachment to it. This is something we can all experience. The death of a loved one, the loss of possession, the loss of your job, your friends, you name it. It's the cause of grief. But there is the good news. There is a way for eliminating the causes of suffering and sorrow. There is a path that transforms the causes of samsara, attachment to external life, into causes that lead to a different state of consciousness. It's called the Noble Eightfold Path. Right conviction, right determination, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right striving, right contemplation, and right meditative contemplation. And the key question here is, of course, what is right? The great thing, however, is, and this shows that Buddhism offers everyone a way out of suffering, that this depends on the state of development. The more spiritually developed you are, the clearer your picture is of what is right. Now, right is a translation of the Pali word sama, which means complete or perfect. Sama diti is the complete or perfect vision. Now, that word right may suggest that there is only one correct view, and that is not the case, as your vision can grow. An imperfect or incomplete vision is not necessarily wrong. I emphasize this in order to rule out any form of dogmatism. In other words, you can also grow into an increasingly correct, increasingly complete vision. However, with regard to the first step, the correct insight or the complete or perfect insight, we can say at least this. You must come to the recognition of the Four Noble Truths. You must realize, and that realization can grow and grow and grow, that the manifested world, the world in a form, in a body, must always be accompanied by pain and suffering because it's temporary, because it passes. You must learn to see, and that is in fact the essential thought of every religion, that the outer world only exists thanks to a force, a living force, a conscious force. It's that force we call consciousness that is much more essential than the form in which that force expresses itself. Focusing on the form is suffering. Focusing on the force behind it frees you from suffering because that force is more lasting. Yes, in essence, that force has always existed and will continue to exist forever. And in light of this correct vision, you can assess the other steps on the path. Take the second, right determination. That means that you should hold the goal to be attained clearly in mind, holding it firm. with discrimination. And the third and the fourth, based on that correct vision and that call, you must of course speak the right words and perform the right deeds. You must learn the discipline to control your thoughts everywhere and all times, to discipline yourself to speak the right words. And often it's better to remain silent and to perform the right deeds, etc., etc. I would like to dwell on the 8th step of this inner path for a moment. Gottfried de Perucker explains it as follows. He says, an unveiled spiritual perception combined with great care in thinking, which is the keynote of all the preceding items, the preceding steps, and which expressed in other words means right meditation with a tranquil mind into which wisdom thus enters. So an unveiled spiritual perception and a great care in thinking. Well, if you are capable of this, then you are already touching upon the stricter requirements imposed on those who walk the faster inner path. And just to be clear, there is no essential difference between the esoteric and the exoteric teachings, the fast or the slow path. There are no privileges, as if one person is allowed and another not. No, you make yourself ready for that path. Nevertheless, that difference must exist. Walking the faster path, which you may call the Chela path, without thinking it through properly, leads to misery. What is that, the Chela path? Chela means disciple, a pupil, student, and in Theosophy it refers to a disciple of one of the masters of wisdom and compassion. They choose the disciples based on the disciples' mentality, the inner willingness to use what they learn solely for the general welfare. So a Chela does not walk the path for himself, but to better able to help and inspire his brothers living in the maze of the outer world.
That phrase seems like a jump.
If you are familiar with Buddhist literature, you will have noticed that Buddha took his more advanced disciples to a mountain for more in-depth teachings. That mountain represents a certain state of consciousness. Moses also received the 10 Commandments on a mountain. And we encounter the same metaphor in the New Testament where Jesus takes his disciples to the mountain. Literally, it says, when he, Jesus, saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. And then it says, he opened his mouth and taught them, saying. That he opened his mouth seems at first glance a pointless remark. After all, you always have to open your mouth if you want to say something. But this entire language, the symbol of the mountain, the separation from the crowds, the opening of the mouth, is full of symbolism. It's a language of the mysteries. In the mystery schools, only the teachers were allowed to open their mouth because they speak with authority. So Jesus opening his mouth means he can teach with authority. So who does he teach? He addresses special disciples, chelas, who have already taken some steps on the inner path. They are now taking a side by Jesus and are giving special instruction. At the end of the Sermon of the Mount, it is emphatically stated that these teachings are not for the masses. The famous passage about not casting pearls before swine. At the end of this lecture seasons, we will devote an entire lecture to the esoteric teachings found in the Sermon of the Mount. It's really a very esoteric teaching. Tonight we will extract some of the ideas that, if we were to follow them, would cause us to speed on the inner path. We have summarized some thoughts from the Sermon on the Mount. First, do not kill. This is already in the Mosaic law. It's the 6th of the 10 commandments. And if you break this law, it says you will be subject to judgment. Jesus fully agrees with this, but he expands on it. He says, anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to the same judgment. And if you call your brother a fool, the same thing will happen, etc., etc. Well, the meaning is crystal clear. It's not only the deed, it's also the thought that causes corresponding consequences. If you are angry, then you also try to do harm. Perhaps a small amount of common sense will stop you, or perhaps fear of punishments will prevent you from turning against your fellow human being. And in itself, that is, of course, preferable rule, but from the perspective of cosmic law, you have still created causes that will bring about their corresponding consequences in time. Because when judgment is mentioned, it does not refer to the Jewish court or law, but to the universal law of cause and effect. How can you walk the path if you want to harm others in your thoughts? Karma works just as well on the mental realm, so such thoughts prevent you from progressing on the path. These thoughts are called ahimsa in the East. Refrain at all times from harming others, neither in deed, nor in word, nor in thought. So do not resist evil by doing evil yourself. And it is very evident in the most famous part of the Sermon on the Mount. Literally it says, and we give it in a slightly abridged form, giving the time, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist evil, but whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone wants to shoe you and take your shirt, let him have your cloak as well. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Well, this fragment is hardly open to two interpretations, I would say. You could say, it could not be clearer. Not only should you not harm your fellow human beings in your actions, you should not do so in your thoughts either. Be kind to your opponent, it says literally. The following passage explains how this compassion toward everyone is intertwined with the path and with the doctrine of karma. I quote, be kind to your adversary in good times, though you are still traveling with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge, and the judge to his servant, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I say to you, you will not get out of there until you have paid the last penny. Does anyone believe that this can be taken literally? Then you would not be safe anywhere in your life. Then you would be living in a dictatorship of the worst kind, in which anyone could drag you to the prison just like that. If you are not on the road with someone. And of course, something else is meant. In this context, being on the road means being alive, being manifested, being maybe on pilgrimage, but being alive. And if you owe your fellow human being, your adversary, something from causes of the past, from previous lives, well, then settle it. And therefore be kind. Therefore repay evil with good. The church is here, of course, the higher self, the Father in heaven. For if you are still in debt to your fellow human beings, if you have not yet worked out selfish causes from the past, or even if you are not enough compassionate towards the other, that church, your inner God, will hand you over to his servant, but you might call the executors of the law of karma, and they will throw you into prison. What prison? The prison of a new personal life on earth. You will then have to reincarnate again. You are only free when you have paid the last penny, have worked out all selfish and personal causes, and have not sown new personal causes. Then the inner path will lead you to the kingdom of heaven. We must live entirely from our higher self, from a different perspective. In Buddhism, this is explained as living, thinking, and acting from the other shore. The word that expresses this is Pāramitās. This is actually a special word that has two different meanings, which are, of course, closely related. The first meaning is someone who has gone to the other shore of the river. But the same word, if you analyze it slightly differently, can also mean to proceed to cross over to the other shore. So on the one hand, Pāramitās means that you are standing on the other shore, and reaching the other shore does not necessarily mean that you have entered nirvana, but rather that you have developed a totally different outlook, a different view on life and on your fellow humans and on everything that lives. And that this different outlook allows you to see everything in a completely different perspective. You no longer see things or humans as life, as separated entities, but as expressions of the one universal life. And on the other hand, Pāramitās means that you make that crossing to the other shore, and that these sublime virtues, Pāramitās, are your travel guide, the qualities you must develop to reach the other shore. But even if you are not yet on the other shore and have not yet fully developed the other vision of life, you can, of course, strive to live according to that other vision. And once you have developed that other vision, those virtues will no longer seem like something to strive for, but rather like qualities that logically follow from that vision of life. Look, if you can read or write, you don't have to keep wondering what those letters mean to you. Do you understand what I mean? It has become automatic to convert letters and words into mental images. If you live from the perspective of the other shore, it is natural, very natural, to practice the virtues. You could not do otherwise. But if you are not there yet, you may sometimes need to pause and reflect. Before I show you those 7 Pāramitās, here is something, an idea that is very essential if you want to practice the virtues in the light of the universal Theosophical movement from the hierarchy of compassion. H.P. Blavatsky gives us this idea in the voice of the silence, where you will find these 7 Pāramitās as well. She says, the first step on the inner path is to live for the benefit of humanity. The second step is the Pāramitās. So the path we advocate is always the path of compassion. Now these are the Pāramitās. Dana, the key of charity and love immortal. Does this not correspond with the call to love everything, even your enemy, as stated in the Sermon on the Mount? But note, loving the other with immortal love. What kind of love is that? Is it personal love? Of course not. It's about evoking the immortal in yourself and loving the immortal in the other. So you don't love the selfishness, the hypocrisy, the cruelty in the other, but you always try to find the immortal element in the other, to focus on that and love it. Does Lao Tse not say something similar when he says, be good to the good and be good to the bad, so that they become good? I've known people who have always seen the best in others, and that is what they focus on. That is what they cherish. And by loving that which is good, even though the personality of such a person may be quite selfish, they turn, to paraphrase Lao Tse, bad people into good people, or at least slightly better people. We don't have time to discuss all 7 Pāramitās. You can find a Lucifer from a few years ago on our website that discusses them in detail. I go through them now very quickly. Sila, the key of harmony in word and act, the key that counterbalances the cause and the effect and leaves no further room for karmic action. Xanthi, patience, sweet, that north can ruffle. Viraka, equanimity to pleasure and pain. This doesn't mean that you become indifferent to the suffering in the world. Certainly not. But you see, through what people call good luck and bad luck, you know that these kinds of external matters arising from your own karmic causes will never lead to lasting happiness or lasting sorrow. Precisely because of this, a smile appears on your face and you see everything calmly and peacefully. Virya, the boundless energy that fights its way to the supernal truth, out of the mire of lies, terrestrial. You may call it spiritual power. The strength will enable you to persevere, even when things are not going well. And suppose you want to give a lecture on Theosophy or something, and no one shows up. In the case of William Quang Church, well, do you give up? Or do you analyze why no one came and then try again? Or suppose you have become angry about a certain thing at work for the umpteenth time. You decide once again to always remain calm. You know, falling down is not a problem, as long as you get back up again. Practicing these 5 Pāramitās is not too difficult or too demanding for anyone. We can all do it, if we want it. The 6th and 7th Pāramitās can only be practiced reasonably well by those who are somewhat more advanced on the inner path. Although, of course, anyone can start practicing them now. Dhyana, profound spiritual intellectual contemplation with utter detachment from all objects of sense and of a lower mental character. We are talking now about the higher reaches of human consciousness, purely Buddhic. Gottfried de Peruka says about this Pāramitā, once the golden gate of dhyana is opened, the pathway stretching thence leads towards the realm of Sat eternal. Sat eternal is the eternal reality. And finally, Prajna, intuitive wisdom. It's the opposite of the brain mind. It's the clear perception to discern clearly, while our limited mind analyzes things and tends to study the details rather than seeing the big picture, prajna is the immediate perception of truth. It is, so says the voice of the silence, the key to which makes a man a god, creating him a bodhisattva, son of the Dhyanis, son of the gods. You understand that there is much more to say about these Pāramitās, which we can practice, not one by one, but try to practice them all. But in any case, I hope I've made it clear that these virtues, intended for chelas, for disciples on the path of initiation, are the safe guide for our development. And anyone who takes Theosophy seriously is a chela. Perhaps a late chela, but in any case, something has been awakened in him. You know, when you look at all these esoteric rules, these virtues, the core is always the same. It's based on unity. And when you take them seriously, you can draw some conclusions about your own life. The Sermon on the Mount, the Pāramitās, but also, for example, the Bhagavad Gita or the paradoxes of Lao-Tse help you to draw those conclusions. They inspire you to draw those conclusions and, above all, to apply them. I don't want to say that they are all exactly the same in all those traditions, but the source, the background is always the same and can always be traced back to the universal Theosophical movement. Within the Theosophical Society, there are also certain guidelines for the more advanced. These are set out in the pledge that dedicated Theosophists could take if they felt called to do so. Now you may ask yourself, to whom do I make this pledge? To Helena Blavatsky? To one of the masters? One of the masters of wisdom and compassion? To the leader of the Theosophical Society? No. You make the pledge to yourself, your higher self. I would like to remind you of the quote from the Sermon on the Mount. Be kind to your adversary, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge, and the judge to his servant, and you be thrown into prison. When you invoke the higher self, you voluntarily submit yourself to the legal authority, to the law of the higher self. And that higher self is therefore the judge. And if you violate your pledge, you will be thrown back in the prison of external existence by the servant of the judge, karma. In other words, if you truly want to live according to the rules of the pledge, you must think carefully before committing yourself to it. For the judge always speaks the truth. There is no mercy. Causes always lead to consequences. But on the other hand, if you study the pledge, and if you compare it with the Sermon on the Mount, with the Pāramitās, with the ethics of the Bhagavad Gita, and if, thanks to Theosophy, you have a picture of the essential unity of life, of the inseparable bonds between all beings, an image of universal brotherhood, however imperfect that image may be, is it not logical, a logical step on the inner path to at least try to live according to this universal ethics? But as always, the choice is yours. That pledge contains 7 rules. We don't have time now to discuss all the 7 of them. You can find the entire pledge in the collected writings of HPB or in one of the esoteric teaching of Gottfried de Peruca. I would just like to conclude this lecture by reflecting on the first article of the pledge. The first one actually contains everything. If we were to apply that rule, that article from the pledge, in our lives, we might not need all the other ones. I pledge myself to endeavor to make Theosophy a living power in my life. if you have any understanding of the greatness and of the depth of Theosophy, then you will also understand why the word endeavor appears in this first article. But realize that if you make this pledge, you must apply what you understand of Theosophy in your life. Indeed, you must actually be it. I would say, think about it. Think about what Theosophy is and what it means when this wisdom of the gods is a living force in your life. Finally, dear friends, how can you be sure that you are on the inner path? Well, if you understand that the path can only be walked by someone who is selfless, who sets aside their own I, their own personality, then the answer is quite simple. If you don't wonder whether you are on the inner path, know that you are walking it successfully. Thank you very much for your attention. There is now a 3-minute break, and after that there is an opportunity to ask questions. You can do that in the YouTube chat or by sending an email to questions@blavatskyhouse.org. And after the questions have been answered, there will be an interactive study via Zoom, and there we can discuss together the ideas from this talk together. Would you like to participate and you're not yet in Zoom? Send an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org. So we send you an email with the Zoom link. The study will not be recorded or broadcasted. Well, in any case, you are most welcome. So I see you in 3 minutes. Welcome back. Henk, are there any questions?
Yeah, sure. There are at the moment 2 questions. One question is related to what you told, Barend, about the Eightfold Path and then Rule 8, so the last step about contemplation. And the question is, what is the difference between right contemplation and meditative contemplation?
Yeah, I think it's, I really can understand the question because they are very related one to another. I think that contemplation, the 8th step on the path, is more deeply than the 7th. I think the 8th one means, but it's my interpretation, it could be different. I think that the 8th one means that you 24 hours a day have that picture of universal brotherhood, of the oneness of life with you. And you cannot do anything else than color the other thoughts you have according to the picture of oneness and universal brotherhood. And the 7th is more that you at set times, in my interpretation, sit down and ponder about truths, about the spirituality of things, and about brotherhood, about oneness. So they are related one to another, of course. And the 8th one is the deepest. But you should see those 8 steps as one packet, as it were. Because if you have the idea of oneness, of course, your thoughts and your livelihood and your actions are also influenced by that. I mean, you cannot separate one from the other. You know, you cannot say, I'm going first to try the first step and then the step. No, it's all together.
Yeah, I think clear. And there is another question is about thinking about the inner path. Is there also an inner path of a nation? How to see that and perhaps also how to change it?
Well,
a group of people.
Well, there is something we call group karma, the karma of a group, because we cause in togetherness actions. We perform actions and we cause together some causes that will lead to consequences that we have to reap as a group, a nation, yeah, of course. But I think that everybody participates in that group and has his own responsibility to make that group a purer or more spiritual entity. So I don't think you can say that a nation is an entity like a human being is an entity, but we can say that it's a collection of beings with lives are interwoven, which because of the past belong to each other, and are therefore helping each other or not. So being a part of a nation, you contribute to the welfare and to the inner path of your fellow human beings in that nation or not. But they have to do it themselves, but we can inspire them. But I would not like to select it to it's not just one nation, because in fact we are all together now.
Yeah.
All the human beings are together, because frontiers are very they are made by they are illusions, and so in fact one thought may affect the whole human race. And in fact we help each other, we stimulate each other, in the contrary, we do things, I would like to say it, but we do things that will lead to situations that we don't like. So we are, as a human race, we belong to each other.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think
don't know if
those
I
were
make
the two
myself
questions.
clear,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah, otherwise it is still possible, I think, during the discussions. Isn't it?
okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I thought it was very inspiring. Thank you for your answers and your contribution. We all learn a lot these evenings, I think. And next week, we are going to start a new series, very interesting also, I think. The essence of universal brotherhood. And the first lecture is universal brotherhood in its utmost depths. And of course, we end with the Gayatri, the Ātman, the golden sun. It's not a prayer, but we try to evoke something within ourselves. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.